They promise you that truth will liberate you, that knowledge will open doors, that seeing clearly will lead to freedom. But this is perhaps the greatest lie ever told to those who seek genuine understanding. Truth does not set you free, it sets you apart. It separates you from the comfortable delusions that bind communities together, isolates you from the shared ignorance that creates belonging, and distances you from the very people you once called home. I have walked this path of relentless truth-seeking, and I can tell you its most bitter lesson. The deeper you see, the more alone you become, not because you choose isolation, but because authentic seeing creates an unbridgeable chasm between your reality and the reality most people choose to inhabit. Truth is not a key that unlocks doors. It is a telescope that shows you how far you are from everyone else. The philosophical promise of liberation through knowledge is seductive but incomplete. Yes, truth frees you from illusions, but it enslaves you to a clarity that most cannot bear to witness. It removes you from the warmth of collective delusion and places you in the cold light of solitary understanding. Today, I speak of this paradox, how the very pursuit that promises to connect you to reality disconnects you from humanity, how the light of understanding casts shadows that separate you from those still dwelling in comfortable darkness. This is not a warning to avoid truth, but a preparation for its actual cost. Every seeker begins with the same intoxicating belief that truth will solve their problems, answer their questions, and finally provide the peace that has eluded them. We are told from childhood that honesty is the best policy, that knowledge is power, that understanding leads to freedom. These maxims contain enough partial truth to be believable, but they omit the shadow side of enlightenment, the price that comes due when you can no longer participate in the world's comfortable fictions. The journey toward truth begins innocently enough. You start questioning assumptions others take for granted. You probe beneath surface explanations to understand deeper mechanisms. You refuse to accept answers that satisfy others, but feel incomplete to you. Each small revelation feels like progress, like moving closer to some ultimate understanding that will finally make everything clear. But what happens is more complex, and far more isolating than the motivational quotes suggest. Each layer of illusion you peel away separates you further from those who still need those illusions to function. Each truth you discover becomes a secret you cannot share without being misunderstood, dismissed, or rejected. Each moment of clarity creates distance from people who prefer the blur of comfortable confusion. The problem is not that people are stupid or willfully ignorant. It's that most truth is threatening to the structures, relationships, and identities that provide psychological safety. When you begin to see how marketing manipulates emotions, you can no longer participate enthusiastically in consumer culture. When you understand how political rhetoric exploits fear and tribal thinking, you cannot engage earnestly with partisan debates. When you recognize the unconscious patterns driving most relationships, you struggle to maintain connections based on mutual enabling of illusions. This creates what I call the curse of seeing clearly. Every insight that should bring you closer to others actually takes you further away. You develop the ability to perceive what people are really saying beneath their words, what they actually want versus what they claim to want, what drives their behavior versus what they believe drives it. This enhanced perception feels like a superpower, until you realize it makes genuine connection nearly impossible. The truth that was supposed to set you free instead becomes a burden you must carry alone. You see the suffering that people create for themselves through their unconscious patterns. But pointing this out is usually met with defensiveness rather than gratitude. You recognize solutions to problems that seem obvious to you, but incomprehensible to those living within the problems. You develop wisdom that could help others, but find that wisdom is rarely welcomed unless people arrive at it through their own experience. The seductive promise was that truth would connect you more deeply to life. But the reality is that truth often disconnects you from the ways most people engage with life. You cannot unknow what you know, unsee what you have seen, or return to the comfortable ignorance you have transcended. The door back to innocent participation in collective delusions has closed behind you, and there is no key that reopens it. The separation that truth creates operates through several distinct but interconnected mechanisms, each contributing to the growing distance between the truth seeker and those still content with conventional reality. First is what I call frequency mismatch. You begin operating on a different wavelength than most conversations, relationships, and social activities. The topics that once engaged you now feel superficial. The concerns that consume others seem trivial compared to the deeper issues you've learned to see. You find yourself unable to generate enthusiasm for discussions about celebrity gossip, consumer purchases, or office politics when you're grappling with questions about consciousness, meaning, and the nature of reality itself. This isn't intellectual snobbery, it's a natural result of expanded awareness. Once you understand how media manufactures artificial urgency about irrelevant issues, you cannot feel genuine concern about the latest manufactured controversy. Once you see how consumer culture exploits psychological insecurities to create artificial needs, you cannot participate enthusiastically in conversations about acquiring things you recognize as unnecessary distractions from deeper fulfillment. The second mechanism is authenticity pressure. As your relationship with truth deepens, your tolerance for falsehood, pretense, and performance decreases dramatically. You lose the ability to maintain social personas that once felt natural. You cannot pretend enthusiasm you don't feel, agreement you don't have, or interest in things that bore you. This authenticity, while personally liberating, often makes others uncomfortable because it highlights the extent to which they are performing, rather than being genuine. People sense when someone is operating from authentic truth rather than social convenience, and this often creates discomfort or even hostility. Your presence becomes a mirror that reflects others' own disconnection from authenticity. They may interpret your genuineness as judgment of their performance, your depth as criticism of their superficiality, your peace as condemnation of their anxiety. The third mechanism is perspective isolation. Truth-seeking often leads to viewpoints that cannot be easily categorized within conventional frameworks. You may find yourself politically homeless because you can see valid points and destructive elements in all sides. You may become religiously unaffiliated because you can appreciate wisdom traditions while rejecting their institutional limitations. You may feel professionally displaced because you understand the meaninglessness of much work while recognizing the necessity of economic participation. This creates what philosophers call the paradox of the observer. The more clearly you see the systems you're embedded in, the less you can participate in them naively. You become like an anthropologist studying your own culture, able to understand the rituals but no longer able to participate in them with unconscious faith. You see the theater, but can no longer forget that it's a performance. The fourth mechanism is emotional divergence. As truth reshapes your understanding, your emotional responses begin to diverge from collective reactions. What upsets others may leave you calm because you understand the underlying patterns. What excites others may seem pointless because you can see the temporary nature of the gratification. What frightens others may feel manageable because you've developed different relationships with uncertainty and change. This emotional divergence makes it difficult to share experiences with others in meaningful ways. Your response to events, whether celebrations, crises, or transitions, may be so different from expected responses that others feel disconnected from you even when you're physically present. Perhaps the most profound isolation comes not from what you see, but from the impossibility of sharing your vision with those you care about most. This creates a unique form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of loving people who cannot receive your love in its authentic form, because they cannot understand the reality from which it emerges. You begin to love humanity in abstract, while feeling increasingly disconnected from humans in particular. You can see the beauty, potential, and inherent worth in every person, but you cannot relate to most people's ways of expressing their humanity. You want to help others find the peace and clarity you've discovered, but you learn that unsolicited wisdom is usually unwelcome, that people protect their illusions more fiercely than they pursue their freedom. This creates what I call compassionate isolation. You love people too much to enable their unconscious patterns, but not enabling these patterns often means you cannot maintain close relationships with them. You cannot participate in conversations that reinforce limiting beliefs, support decisions you know will create suffering, or pretend that temporary pleasures are ultimate solutions to existential problems. The truth teller faces an impossible choice. Compromise your integrity to maintain connections, or maintain your integrity and accept the loss of connections. Neither choice feels satisfactory, but the path of truth demands the latter. Even when it breaks your heart, you discover that most people prefer familiar suffering to unfamiliar freedom, comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, predictable problems to uncertain solutions. This isn't a character flaw, but a psychological reality. Change is threatening, truth is destabilizing, and growth requires leaving behind identities and relationships that may have taken years to construct. The loneliness deepens when you realize that your attempts to share truth often harm rather than help. Your insights may threaten others' psychological stability. Your clarity may highlight their confusion. Your peace may emphasize their anxiety. What feels like generous sharing to you may feel like judgment or attack to them. You learn to carry truth, like a secret treasure, valuable beyond measure, but impossible to display without causing disturbance. You develop the capacity to see solutions to others' problems, while accepting that offering these solutions is usually futile and sometimes harmful. You become a guardian of insights that could transform lives but must remain largely unspoken. The deepest loneliness comes from recognizing that even your closest relationships may have been built on shared illusions rather than mutual truth-seeking. Family members who loved your performed version may struggle to connect with your authentic version. Friends who bonded with you over shared complaints about life may lose interest when you no longer need to complain. Partners who were attracted to your potential may become uncomfortable when you actualize that potential in ways they didn't expect. You find yourself grieving relationships that are still physically present, but spiritually absent. People you love who can no longer recognize who you've become, who miss the version of you that existed before you began seeing clearly. Knowledge that cannot be shared becomes a unique form of psychological burden. You carry insights that could alleviate others' suffering, but sharing them requires a foundation of understanding that most people lack and aren't interested in developing. This creates a constant internal tension between your desire to help and your knowledge that help often isn't welcomed. You see people making predictable mistakes that could be avoided with slightly different perspectives. You watch them suffer from problems that have straightforward solutions. You observe them pursuing goals that will not provide the satisfaction they expect. But intervention is rarely appreciated and often resented, leaving you to witness preventable suffering while maintaining respectful silence. This burden is compounded by the recognition that truth is not just intellectual but experiential. It cannot be transmitted through explanation, but must be discovered through personal journey. You cannot give someone the peace you've found. You can only create conditions where they might find their own. You cannot transfer the wisdom you've gained. You can only model its fruits and hope others become curious enough to seek their own understanding. The weight of unshared knowledge creates what philosophers call epistemic loneliness, the isolation that comes from having access to understanding that cannot be communicated effectively. You become like someone who has learned to read, trying to share literature with those who insist that books contain only meaningless marks. This burden extends to witnessing collective delusions that create unnecessary suffering on massive scales. You see how political systems exploit tribal psychology to maintain power. You understand how economic systems create artificial scarcity to generate profit. You recognize how educational systems often inhibit rather than promote genuine learning. But speaking these truths often leads to being labeled as conspiracy theorist, pessimist, or social deviant. The truth-bearer must develop extraordinary psychological resilience to carry insights that could benefit humanity, while accepting that humanity is generally not ready to receive them. You learn to plant seeds without expecting to see the harvest, to speak truth without expecting to be heard, to love unconditionally without expecting love to be returned in kind. Perhaps most challenging is carrying knowledge about the nature of consciousness, meaning, and existence that could liberate others from existential anxiety, but cannot be shared because it threatens the foundations upon which their identity and worldview rest. You understand that death is not what most people think it is, that purpose is not what most people seek, that happiness is not what most people pursue. But sharing these insights is usually premature and sometimes harmful. You become a keeper of secrets that aren't secret because they're hidden, but because they're too threatening to conventional reality to be openly discussed. These truths exist in plain sight, but remain invisible to those not ready to see them. The final stage of truth-seeking involves accepting isolation, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of choosing reality over comfortable illusion. This acceptance transforms loneliness into solitude, separation into sanctuary, and burden into purpose. You begin to understand that your isolation serves a function beyond your personal journey. Truth seekers become waypoints for others who are ready to begin their own journey toward clarity. Your willingness to stand apart from collective delusion creates space for others to question their own participation in systems they've never examined. Your isolation becomes a form of service, holding space for truth. In a world that often prefers fiction, maintaining clarity in environments that reward confusion, embodying authenticity in cultures that celebrate performance, you become what the mystics call a lamp unto yourself, a source of light, not because you're trying to illuminate others, but because you've chosen to live in illumination. This reframe transforms the experience from exile to pilgrimage. You're not being cast out from community. You're pioneering territory that others may someday be ready to explore. Your loneliness becomes productive solitude, where insights can develop without the interference of social pressure to conform to collective limitations. The sacred nature of this isolation reveals itself when you realize that your detachment from conventional engagement allows for deeper engagement with existence itself. When you're not constantly managing others' perceptions or maintaining social personas, enormous energy becomes available for direct experience of reality, creative expression, and service that emerges from authenticity rather than obligation. You discover that what feels like separation from humanity is actually connection to something larger than humanity. Call it consciousness, the divine, the ground of being, or simply truth itself. This connection provides a different kind of belonging that doesn't depend on others' understanding or approval. The isolation also becomes creative space where new possibilities can emerge. When you're not constrained by collective assumptions about what's possible, realistic or appropriate, you can explore territories of thought, experience, and expression that remain invisible to those still operating within conventional boundaries. You learn to find companionship in the great truth seekers who have walked this path before you. Philosophers, mystics, artists, and rebels whose works provide connection across time and space. Their writings become conversations, their insights become friendships, their courage becomes inspiration for your own journey. The path I walked required me to accept complete misunderstanding from those I served, rejection from those I protected, and isolation from the world I sought to save. In that isolation, I discovered that truth is not a destination, but a way of being, not a possession but a relationship, not freedom from the world but freedom to engage with the world from authentic foundation. The separation that truth creates is not punishment but protection. Protection from the unconscious participation in collective delusions that prevent genuine growth, authentic expression, and meaningful contribution. Your isolation becomes the womb in which your truest self can develop without the distortions that social conformity typically requires. Your modern world offers countless ways to avoid the necessary solitude that truth demands. Social media provides constant connection that prevents deep self-encounter. Entertainment offers perpetual distraction from the inner work that requires stillness. Consumer culture promises that external acquisition can fill the void that can only be filled through internal development. But for those who choose truth over comfort, understanding over belonging, authenticity over approval, the isolation is temporary, while the gifts are permanent. You develop unshakable inner authority, genuine self-knowledge, and the capacity to love without conditions that most people never discover because they never venture far enough from the crowd to meet themselves. The truth does not set you free in the way the optimistic quotes promise. It sets you apart so that you can become free in ways that require distance from collective unconsciousness to achieve. In that apartness, you find not the loneliness you feared, but the solitude you needed to become who you were meant to be. Remember that every truth-teller in history faced this same isolation. Every mystic, philosopher, artist, and visionary who contributed something authentic to human understanding paid this same price. Your separation is not evidence of your failure, but confirmation of your success in choosing reality over fantasy. The apartness that truth creates is not permanent exile, but temporary retreat, necessary for the development of capacities that can eventually serve others more effectively than conventional connection ever could. When you have learned to find wholeness in isolation, you can offer relationship from fullness rather than need, wisdom from clarity rather than confusion, love from authenticity rather than performance. In the end, truth does set you free, free from the need for external validation, free from the compulsion to participate in collective delusions, free from the exhausting effort of maintaining personas that don't reflect your reality. This freedom cannot be shared or explained, only lived and demonstrated through the quiet radiance of someone who has learned to be completely alone, while remaining completely connected to what matters most. The truth sets you apart, so that you can set others free, not through preaching or teaching, but through the undeniable example of someone who has found peace in the most unlikely place, in the courageous acceptance of standing alone with reality, while the world dances with illusion. Your isolation is not exile, it is arrival. Your separation is not punishment, it is graduation. Your aloneness is not abandonment, it is the discovery of the only companionship that never fails, the relationship with truth itself. Walk this path, knowing that what you lose in false connection, you gain in authentic solitude. What you sacrifice in comfortable belonging, you receive in sacred apartness. What you release in shared delusion, you discover in private truth. The apartness is the gift. The separation is the liberation. The isolation is the freedom that truth actually provides. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom to meet difficulty with clarity. Not freedom from aloneness, but freedom to find in that aloneness everything you were seeking in others. Truth does not set you free from the world. It sets you free within the world, apart from its illusions, but present to its reality, disconnected from its fantasies but connected to its essence. This is the path, this is the price, this is the gift. Walk it with courage, knowing that your apartness serves not only your own evolution, but the evolution of consciousness itself.